Luego de este panel de estudiantes y graduados que el CEERI siempre trata de tener presente en todos sus eventos, en todos sus congresos, lo cual nos enorgullece porque queremos escuchar las investigaciones, la forma de pensar de las nuevas generaciones. Siempre tratamos de impulsar esto y también tratamos de conocer y tener puntos de vista distintos con expertos de todo el mundo. Y esto se va a dar en esta conferencia que viene a continuación.
Sí, efectivamente. Como comentó Mariano, nosotros tenemos el grupo CEERI Joven que aborda nuevas temáticas y fueron ellos los que sugirieron la necesidad de incorporar en este congreso un tema, digamos, con un enfoque diferente, que justamente las aproximaciones no occidentales de las relaciones internacionales. Y nos pareció oportuno poder abordar este tema y por eso tenemos un encuentro magistral con el profesor Mallavarapu, que es un profesor indio con mucha experiencia en el tema.
Sí, la verdad que es un orgullo poder tenerlo y poder también comprender cómo ven las relaciones internacionales desde un enfoque que no es el habitual para los estudiantes, sobre todo, donde siempre se focaliza quizás en los europeos o americanos. Y está bueno también poder tener cómo se enseñan las relaciones internacionales desde India y cómo se las entiende para poder tener una comprensión más global sobre los hechos que nos ocurren. Así que damos paso a la moderación para dar inicio a este gran panel.
Thank you very much, Professor, for being here with us today. It's really a pleasure to have you and on such an interesting topic about non-Western AR developments. So it's really an honor for us to have you here in the conference. I will briefly introduce you and then give you the floor so you can give a brief presentation. Professor Siddharth Mallavarapu is a professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Shiv Nadar University. He has considerable research and teaching experience in the discipline of international relations, AR, and takes a special interest in the evolution and instantiation of the discipline of international relations in India. He has published widely and taught a vast array of courses, both at undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral levels. He is currently co-series editor of Critical Global Thought, published by Oxford University Press. Professor has also been a senior fellow at the Center for Global Cooperation Research, Duisburg, and visiting professor at Sciences Po in Paris. He's an editorial board member from July 1st, 2018 to December 1st, 2021, for the journal Global Perspectives, which is published by the University of California Press. And finally, he has also served as adjunct fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis for a period of 2 years, and has also been a member of the editorial team of the journal Strategic Analysis and the Indian Journal of International Law. Besides all that, the professor has several books published, and he's an expert in AR and Indian AR, and recently has also published something about Chinese AR, if I'm not mistaken. So a broad vision about AR development. So Professor, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Federico. And at the outset, I'd like to thank my hosts, CEERI, for having invited me to this particular event. I understand it's translated in English as the Center for Strategic Studies of International Relations. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be also speaking to younger people. I'd like to begin by saying that this is an exciting time to be in a discipline called international relations and to be thinking about issues in the discipline of international relations. I'll basically flag 8 or 9 elements which I think are important to think about, and then hopefully have an interesting conversation on those issues, or even not necessarily to what I've said immediately in the course of my presentation. I'd be happy to take some questions and address these issues as well. At the outset, I think one, of course, for any of us located in this part of the world, we are particularly conscious of the fact that international relations is an ethnocentric construct, which means that it predominantly has one kind of ethnocentrism embedded in its very nature. And this is, of course, Anglo-American ethnocentrism. And which also means that international relations as a discipline seems to be tied up to the fortunes of the major powers. So you had, of course, Pax Britannica, and you had Britain exercising a great degree of influence, the manner in which international relations, at least the early phase of its development, seem to have been instantiated. Subsequently, of course, post-Second World War, we're all aware of Pax Americana, and to think about the influence the United States has had, particularly in shaping the discipline. And arguably, one could think about today whether this whole question about whether material power has a strong basis in terms of determining our categories of the world, in determining our maps of the world, and how does that pan out when it comes to thinking about specific geopolitical configurations and their influence when it comes to shaping a discipline called international relations. So I think it's important to think about all of these issues. Way back in 1977, Stanley Hoffman characterized international relations as an American social science. So maybe as a thought experiment, it would be interesting to ask younger people what they think of Hoffman's argument today. Has anything fundamentally changed? Is international relations still an American social science predominantly? Or is something really changing? One, of course, I think quite clearly there is a discourse today, even in mainstream international relations, around issues like emerging powers and rising powers and things like that, which means, of course, that there is, again, a greater degree of receptivity to new actors or actors who begin to come into their own in the international system. But this, again, gets us back to that original question about material power and standing as a basis to be receptive to ideas from a particular location. I think more fundamentally at a philosophical level, we can ask this question whether context has a bearing in terms of how we study something. Is international relations the same thing, studying it in a class in Washington, studying it in a class in Rio, or studying it in a class in New Delhi here, or in Beijing, or elsewhere in the world? What changes? What changes? So I think there are interesting ways to think about this question about context. And if you don't like a word like epistemology, what we're really talking about is the influence context has on knowledge. And also, when we say context, you could use the word ontology, if you like, which is to really think about the location of a particular place and how it influences how we think about the world. So does our map of the world, in a sense, is determined largely by our location? Is theory as an activity also influenced by where we are and what we do? Is there a certain language in which dominant idioms are posed, and therefore it excludes the whole range of actors because they don't necessarily speak the same language? What do the filters of culture and history have to offer when it comes to the manner in which we think about a whole range of issues in our own neighborhood, for instance, and how we can think about the relationship even with our own location and the rest of the world? I think there is a great deal of churning around all of these questions today in international relations, and which is why I think it's such an inviting time for all young people particularly to take interest in it, and for us to learn more about each other. So one way to think about it is also to think about it in terms of questions which seem to matter across time and place. So for instance, you could say, do notions of order, or do notions of justice, or do notions of legitimacy have a much wider resonance, and it's not specific to any one political collectivity, but surely different civilizations, different cultures, different contexts, there has been intellectual history and thought around some of these questions. The other way to look at it also is to think about the fact that different contexts may also bring to bear. I think Terry Norden, the philosopher, once argued that different traditions ask different questions. So also an openness then to think about not just the standard laundry list of 4 or 5 elements we have in a regular account of international relations, but to really to read the lines, to go beyond those 4 or 5 standard formulations, and to really begin opening up archives, figures, texts, which are not really known outside some of these contexts. And they're not known for a variety of reasons. So I would suggest here that, sometimes it may not have to do with the quality of thought as much as the fact that some texts have not traveled to the extent that they perhaps could have or should have traveled in terms of enriching our understanding of specific questions we may be interested in. So that's, I think, one set of issues which we need to bear in mind. The other, I think, every discipline has an identity. And I would say that's true also of international relations, which means that there is a nucleus of concerns. There are some making questions. There is a certain grammar of socialization in that particular field of study. So very often people argue that traditional international relations has been interested in the question of what causes war, and to think about ways of addressing it. Is war eliminable? Or can war be prevented, if not eliminated? So some of this is, of course, being the source of a fairly long tradition of thinking within international relations. But I would think that it's also important to widen the gamut, to think about other sets about how we also characterize what we treat as the international in the first place. Today, of course, there's a plea for a global international relations. I think Amitav Acharya has written fairly extensively about it, but there are a whole range of other scholars who are also talking about a global IR. What does the global really mean today? Is it merely tokenism of one kind? Is it merely, just representation of different countries from different continents? Or is there more to what we mean by the term global? How do we make this term global really speak to intellectual traditions from different parts of the world, to different ways of living in different parts of the world, to different modes of cognizing sometimes, even the same questions, and sometimes to also think about new questions, which have hitherto not been addressed in the manner in which they perhaps deserve to be addressed in the mainstream of the discipline. So I think all these issues are important to think about. There are a number of interesting examples now, particularly in the sphere of disciplinary histories of international relations, where scholars have pointed out to the neglect of certain traditions of thinking. One example, I'll just give you an illustration of this. Robert Vitalis and his work on the Howard School, the Howard School in the United States, where you had a number of leading Afro-American thinkers contribute very interesting pieces of work. And one of the points Vitalis makes is that imperialism was an important question which was addressed in international relations in its early history, but was subsequently obscured, or it fell off the shelf. And that's not an accident. He feels that that reflects a manner in which international relations became much more to do with the modalities of governance and the modalities of rule and the modalities of empire building, as opposed to thinking about the world in other ways. So it's important to be alive to these kinds of histories which talk about various forms of exclusion. I think in recent years there have been other accounts which have been added to this. I know for a fact that there's work by Peter Whale and Vineet Thakur on the South African story and the manner in which the discipline evolved in that context. So I think it's interesting to look at these accounts to also give us a sense that, one, I think international relations, as we understand it, should not be too narrowly defined. And if we are interested in the category of the international, if we are interested in the manner in which people have related to the world outside, it really opens up a much wider canvas of possible sources to think about issues. So that's something I think we need to bear in mind. The other illustration I wanted to give you is really, there's several ways in which we can think about this category called the Global South. And at one plane you could say it's sort of a geographical category, but I think as we've argued in a book, a book put together by my colleague B.S. Chimney and myself, one of the things we suggested also is to think about Global South in terms of sensibilities. Sensibilities based on location, sensibilities based on a certain history. And to sort of think about it not merely as a geographical category, but much more in terms of how it shapes the way we think about the world because of a specific trajectory of history, because of specific cultural experiences in that context, because of specific geopolitics which have acted in those parts of the world in which we find ourselves, histories of colonialism, of course. All of that has a bearing in a very fundamental way in what we treat as worthwhile studying and worthwhile knowing about in relation to the field or sphere which we'd like to call international relations. So I wanted to give you, there's several, in these 10 minutes, I wanted to keep it brief, but I wanted to give you at least one illustration of what a critical perspective might mean. And one particular intellectual formation I've been particularly interested in, especially in recent years, is a tradition in international law called TWAIL, which means Third World Approaches to International Law, okay, TWAIL. And TWAIL is, it's a collective of thinkers. There are several scholars who contribute to it. I can think of people from South America as well, Boaventura Santos, but also people from other parts of the world, James Gatti, Vasuki Nesaya, my colleague here, B.S. Chimney. Many of them have contributed, I think, interesting ideas to thinking about the specific tradition called TWAIL. And the reason why I picked this as an illustrative case is because international law anchors us in the real world. It's not some airy-fairy, kite flying, but it's something which you can look at concrete texts, you could look at concrete conventions, you could look at the practice of international law, you could look at violations. You can study it from a critical global south perspective in a very concrete fashion. And I would think that the analytics which TWAIL allows us to use is not again specific only to international law. I feel it has a much wider resonance in life and can be used well beyond this. So I'll give you a set of propositions or ideas, and I'll stop with that. And then I'd be happy to have a discussion around these questions or other issues which you may have in mind. One, of course, the assumption in TWAIL is that the world is not a tabula rasa. It's not a clean slate. Okay. TWAILers argue that imperial and colonial continuities continue to persist in the contemporary world. So we have to be alive to historical residues, historical influences, history, the past shaping the present is something we need to be alive to. Okay, that's one element. Second, they argue that the justificatory rationales for colonial forms of rule or modes of rule continue to persist. And what were the two justificatory rationales for colonialism? These have been widely talked about. One, of course, is trade. And second is what is referred to as the civilizing mission. So it assumes other forms, but it continues to be. So an example Anthony Angie would give you, for instance, on the civilizing mission is to look at the discourse around good governance, or to look at the discourse around failed states, and say, give you a sense of, why those histories have sometimes persisted in different forms, and why our current formulations sometimes don't really speak to earlier histories in a very conscious fashion. So I think that's important to bear in mind. Third, I think we need to recognize that schisms of race, gender, class continue to structure international life. So unproblematized universality is a problem. Fourth, the world is characterized by uneven development, but uneven development has to do with the broader historical structuring of the international system. So that's something we need to bear in mind. TWAILers are also interested in forms of opposition to prevailing dominant structures. So there is a politics of resistance sometimes in terms of ideas, in terms of practices, in terms of thinking about exemplars. So the anti-colonial nationalist movements, for instance, is of considerable interest to TWAILers in order to learn lessons about how we can transform sometimes fairly dominant political structures. Sixth, we can ask this question about the creation of the contestation of the high moral ground, sometimes occupied by the major powers. So there is an element, Anne Offord and the others have argued about liberal paternalism, which is present in the international system, and it's important to problematize these elements. So there is also the question of double standards in the observance of international law. Think about drones, for instance, or drone attacks. There is also an important need here to distinguish between what is referred to as ruling elites and people. I think trailers like B.S. Chimney have made this argument particularly strongly and have argued that we need to base our understanding on the lived experience of people. And the lived experience of people is different from that of the state itself. So that's something we need to bear in mind. And finally, of course, there is opposition to nihilism, which is to say that trailers do believe that there are certain values worth claiming and worth supporting. So if you want to think about the idea of global justice, you can ask, what does it mean in a world characterized by global and wealth and income inequalities? What would the word justice mean today in that context? What would it mean for my context, where I'm located in a particular part of the world? That I think also becomes important. So I think these are some elements which are important to think about. For many of us in this part of the world, we look at decolonization as an incomplete project, especially when it comes to knowledge systems. So for those of you in international relations, in a field of study called international relations, I think you have to address yourself in some form or the other to this question about decolonizing IR and what would that mean. There's a book by that name, a very fine edited book by Branwen Gruffit Jones, for any of you who are interested in looking at what might be this intellectual agenda of decolonizing international relations and what it might look like. But I think that's a question worth asking and thinking about. So this is not to say that we reject all categories and concepts coming from a particular part of the world, namely the West, merely because it comes from there, but to suggest that we critically examine various influences and also participate in a global conversation from where you are, and not necessarily to seed the ground and say, everything is received wisdom. I think that would be not really what a good attitude towards decolonizing knowledge systems might entail. It requires an element of active agency. It involves an element of active storytelling from different parts of the world. It involves building on lived experiences. It involves being open to texts and archives which have not been unearthed so far. It requires an openness to intellectual figures who may have had various global influences shaping them. But all of this, I think, is very much worth thinking about for students embarking on the study of international relations. I think I'll stop with that, and I'll be open to questions from you, Federico, and happy to take them.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was super interesting. I think you touched upon many different things, also giving us an example of how to or how something non-Western or critical post-colonial would look like. Which it was very nice, because sometimes when we start inquiring about how to develop non-Western, we find like how it will be, how we should start. And I think you pointed towards history as a tool that AR needs to come back and get back to start seeing why certain people growth in certain moments, specific things to understand the world, and how that shapes our understanding. You talk also about the persistence of colonialism still nowadays, even though maybe political imperialism somehow disappeared or looks like have been disappeared. One of the questions there is, in what regards would you say that thinking in terms of theories also limit the developments of non-Western AR, or because somehow Western developments put the standard that non-Western should reach to start discussing verso? How we should address it? What do you think are our paths that we can follow to try to move around that?
That's an excellent question to think about. And I think theory is important, because very often one of the arguments also made about empirics and theory is that theory is produced in the global north, and the empirics and the empirical work is left to the global south in some sense. That most of the production of fundamental theories and ideas there in that sense seem to be very often as confined in the manner in which at least the production of ideas and its dissemination in the academic world is concerned. And this is, of course, being contested, and I think it's a good thing. I think people from very different parts of the world are interested in theoretical questions, theoretical issues. But you're right in saying, you're asking the question, is there a hegemony of form? Is there a dominant form to which we're all, is there a gold standard to which we're all expected to adhere to? And isn't that part of the problem? And I would think I agree with that, that there is sometimes the expectation that, we must have our own Walesians and we must have our own Walses and we must have our own Wendts, our own constructivists, our own realists, our own liberals in the manner in which it's understood. But actually, one studies figures, intellectual figures particularly, I feel it's always a little more complex, and that these labels don't do that much justice to these figures. You could say, of course, in India, very often there's a temptation to refer to a figure like Kautilya or Chanakya as the quintessential realist. But I would think there's more to Kautilya than just realism. And it would be important to also not merely look at canonical figures, but to really spread the figures also we study and not confine ourselves just to one or two of these figures who are better known. So I think it's important for us, one, to give us our readers, especially when we are attempting work in the realm of theory, to give our readers a good working definition of what we regard as theory in that particular context. And second, make our interventions in a manner which is also accessible then to a wider audience, which allows for it to be read widely and of course sourced well. And also, I think, restoring intellectual context in which these ideas were produced. That is important because theory does not also operate in a vacuum. Theory is also made by fallible human beings like us. Human beings can make mistakes, and they can sometimes some other theory could come and knock down another theory tomorrow. That's a possibility. Also, we're living in a time and age in international relations when there's a lot of skepticism about grand theory. So does realism answer all my questions in this part of the world when I'm interested in some middle-level foreign policy dilemma? No, not necessarily. It doesn't answer all my questions. So maybe also the scale of theorizing, the range of theorizing, we need to think about this also more carefully and not necessarily feel obliged to produce exactly or analogous theories in the manner in which have been produced elsewhere. I think there should be a little more leeway for us to innovate, but I do think it's important for us to also be rigorous, which means that we substantiate our claims well in terms of historical sources, a good conversation between history and theory, anchored again in specific questions. Maybe there's a larger tradition addressing these questions, locating it within this broader sociology of knowledge. I think some of these elements are also important, and of course clarifying what our particular theoretical understanding seeks to explain, and if it's doing a good job of explaining what it seeks to explain. I think all of this would be important.
Thank you very much. And I would like to follow up with something that you mentioned at the end, this idea of the ground theories and how I remember reading Amitabh Acharya and Barry Busan non-Western developments. They were saying that one of the holy grails of theorists is to find a theory that works all the time in every place, which relates directly to one of the first points that you made about ethnocentrism, right? And which is something that you mentioned that could be a limitation regarding the building of non-Western AR that sometimes might end up falling in that same category of thinking that our own developments could be applied somewhere else. Which are other limitations that you find in the development? Which are other risks that you find in starting thinking about non-Western AR?
Okay, one of course is some would argue this binary between Western and non-Western IR is a starting point of concern, which is to say that the world doesn't map neatly into Western and non-Western to begin with. neither the West is a monolith, nor is the non-West a monolith. Even if you use the global North and the global South, there is the global North within the global South. There is the global South within the global North. So there's a certain element of fluidity also in the manner in which we need to think about these categories. And some would say these binaries are not very helpful. They're rather limiting. But I would argue that one way to look at it is to think about, when we are talking about the West here, we're really using it as a shorthand to refer to a particular structure of domination and influence in the world. And whether you call it the West or you call it something else, that doesn't change. It has had a degree of influence. It has had an unprecedented degree of influence. Some would argue that that was for the good. Apologists of empire like Neil Ferguson would say, oh, colonialism at the end of the day was not such a bad thing. But we don't agree with that point of view, for instance. There are many who would argue from, the global South that, no, colonialism was terrible in terms of many of the ill effects of it, including our diffidence when it comes to knowledge systems, particularly, and that legacy is not completely undone. We need to feel more confident about ideas being propounded from other parts of the world and also contribute more as fuller members to that conversation, fuller and equal members to that conversation globally. I think that's something which is important to highlight as well. So I think the point about limitations, apart from this limitation of having sometimes see all theory in terms of just the dominant variance of it is one limitation. Second, as I just mentioned a little while back, there may be the risk of sometimes being dubbed as provincial merely because it's privileging a certain context. But again, if you look at the history of international relations, you had what the historian Dipesh Chakraborty would call the provincialism of Europe presenting itself as universal truth. It's done it successfully to a large extent. So you can have different forms of provincialism presenting themselves as truth, and that's, or presenting themselves as universal truth. And that, some would argue, is also problematic and needs to be avoided. So that's something to think about as well. Third, I think we have to, I think part of the struggle sometimes is also to find a language in which we can communicate these ideas to a wider audience, an audience which may be unfamiliar with our own setting, our own context, our own background. This is not to say that none of this matters, it matters a lot, but how successfully are we able to persuade others to think about a certain set of ideas in the terms we frame? And can we think about texts, figures, contexts on our own terms, not always mediated through 20 figures from the standard canon of Western IR theory, but or Anglo-American IR theory, but can we think about it outside of that frame, and what would that look like, so that's one element also to think about. Fourth, I think the point I raised earlier about material strength and the openness to ideas. If it is only material strength which is determining, why is there a lot of interest in Chinese international relations theory? It has to do with the fact that China is seen to have a much larger global footprint today than it did, say, maybe even 3 decades ago. So that's changed, and therefore there is a lot of interest. And I think you can also see that there's more work which is traveling to other parts of the world and where they're trying to articulate what they would treat as a distinctive view or perspective or set of perspectives on international relations thinking, drawing on their own classical traditions. So I think we're going to see more of this in the years ahead. But I think we should be also willing to look at actors who are not necessarily dominant, who are not necessarily geopolitically significant alone, who are not necessarily in material terms, but they could be homes of very interesting ideas, which we may want to think and consider carefully. So I think we need to think about a far more egalitarian ecology for ideas itself. And that's a challenge. Right now, I think the political economy of idea production and the manner in which academia is structured globally, it continues to be skewed in particular fashions, whether it comes to journals, when it comes to funding priorities, when it comes to, big ticket projects. All of this, to an extent, is also shaped by the existing structures of power, and we can't be innocent about it. So again, it depends also on how incentive structures in these other countries, encourage a younger generation of scholars to actively mine their own resources, to develop a politics of self-esteem when it comes to ideas from their own backyard, and then, of course, be open to a global conversation. Don't close yourself off from other influences. I think it's very important to be influenced by ideas outside your home and from around the world, but then to critically reflect on these ideas and see where it comes in contact with material you're comfortable with, and maybe from it will emerge something interesting as well. So we need to be open to it, but there are these challenges. And I also would say that at this point, I don't know if we've really come up with something, at this stage, immediately to offer, say, okay, we have, if you say this, I have an option to this, and it's this. I don't think we are there right now in terms of that neatness of that kind of expectation. I think we will get there eventually, where there will be a number of far more strident and confident and interest, which have, of course, a much larger appeal globally. But I think we have to be patient, even in terms of thinking around these questions.
Thank you once again. An extremely interesting answer. I would like to touch upon something. Me as professor, I know there are other professors watching. You are a professor as well. So sometimes one of the challenges we have is how to start exploring these things during the undergraduate degree. How do we introduce all these topics? Do we need to first talk about mainstream AR to then show other perspectives? I think it would be very interesting if you could briefly explore a little bit. How do you do that? How do you recommend starting doing that? So we can also take these insights and work with us in our own universities.
Right. No, I think this is you hit the nail on the head. This is the most important question in some sense, because it deals ultimately with how we would like the discipline to be reproduced, how we'd like to socialize a new generation of young people into thinking critically about the world and the field of study. So that's important. And to think about issues of curricular development, and also pedagogy. How do we get this across to a millennial generation, which is, of course, it has its own ways of learning and picking new things. So all of this. So precisely to do this, some years ago, my colleague and I put together this little volume. It's called International Relations: Perspectives for the Global South. And we felt the same urge or need you felt, which is to say that, how can we not do the same thing again, and make the same mistakes again? Let's make new mistakes. Let's not make the old mistakes, So again, so when we thought about the structure of this book, both B.S. Chimney and I gave some thought to what are the concepts we would like to introduce students to when they get into a field of study called international relations, which standard mainstream textbooks of international relations don't necessarily do. So we had, for instance, here chapters on race and international relations, a chapter on class and international relations, a chapter on gender and IR, but we also had conceptual chapters on colonialism, on imperialism, on sovereignty, on security, geopolitics, development, sustainable development, and cosmopolitanism. Okay, so that was one way of thinking about the structure of it, which is to say, okay, let's expose students to all these ideas and these concepts, and let's conceptualize and allow them to conceptualize and think about these various concepts. And the other is to also bring in global perspectives on these questions. So what is it to be talking about something like global history today? Is global history one site where students of international relations can think about interconnections differently as opposed to our standard IR models of interconnection? What is it to be talking about global economic governance today? What does that mean? What does global migration mean? Can we think about global justice? Can we think about global culture? Is there anything like that at all? Or are these two large umbrella concepts which are not very useful? So to ask these questions. And of course, we also threw in a chapter here we thought was important for students in this part of the world studying international relations. It's titled Gandhi and World Politics, to really think through Gandhi and with Gandhi about questions of reconciliation, questions of peace and conflict, the role of nonviolence, and some of these issues as well. As an example or illustration of, okay, if you were to look at a figure, how would you sort of tease out the international in that? And some of my work, along with my mentor, Kanti Bajpai, Professor Kanti Bajpai at the National University of Singapore, is also an attempt to bring together, elements of thinking of India's international and strategic thought. Again, drawing on a variety of figures dating back to the colonial period, but bringing it up to the contemporary. So the arc of the international, to think about the strategic elements in terms of how India related to the world post-independence, and prior to that, what were the various images of the international floating around, and to make sense of it. So thinking about a textbook of international relations would be very useful in whichever context you find yourself in. I think for me, the challenge would be to do an interesting edited volume, maybe bringing together contributors from Africa, contributors from South America, contributors of the Arab world. And you could run through the standard laundry list and menu of mainstream topics, but get people with a critical eye to write about all of those topics. And maybe use that as a primer to introduce new students to international relations. So we don't start off with, with theory of international relations and start off with, these iconic figures and, you're in all of these iconic figures, and then everything else after that is derivative from there. I think we need to sometimes, reboot and try something else, even in terms of the manner in which we do it. But I would think some exposure to different slices of thinking in different parts of the world is vital. It should not also be only locked into a certain orbital. But I do think you can't think of ideas today without interconnections. You can't think of histories without interconnections. So inevitably you will stumble onto other things. You can't talk about colonialism without talking also about the colonizer, at some level. So inevitably it ties up a whole range of other issues. I hope it answers in part your question at least.
Thank you once again. And it is very nice the approaching maybe international relations rather than through theories, through issues, through topics where we can explore different views about each topic, which are luckily for us now are starting to be discussed again. Gender, race. We are starting to be more conscious about all these things that we sometimes give for granted in international relations. And I think all these developments, which might be still in a very initial phase, are very important for us to start decolonizing our discipline and to start bringing to the discipline things that are on our own, and to start thinking of our own and to appreciate what our own people have thought about international relations before. So I think sadly we run out of time, but I would like to thank you again. This was an extremely interesting talk. Just to close up, and I would like to again bring the importance of history, to start thinking about these things, to realize how sometimes it's very weird because we study contemporary history, and contemporary history is all European history or global history that is presented to be global, this European history, and that's an excellent starting point to start valuing what we have. So that how we start thinking in university, how all these topics start being brought up, I think are all insights that we can take from the talk. So once again, it was a real pleasure for me to talk to you today. And I don't know if you want to leave a final message for all the students and professors that are listening, maybe a final recommendation about non-Western developments. Please, you can go ahead.
Okay. No, I would just, encourage students to be curious about the world and to be curious about their own context to begin with. I think they would stumble onto some very interesting things if they persist with that curiosity. And I think, like I would reiterate what I said at the outset. It's an interesting time. It's a really, I think, interesting time to be doing international relations, studying international relations. At this particular phase we find ourselves in. And I think for younger people, the discipline offers a whole set of possible perspectives today, which perhaps was not even the case some years ago. Thank you.
Thank you once again. And well, we go back to Mariano, dear Mariano and Mika to continue with the conference.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor. Y fue un honor tenerlo en esta cuarta conferencia mundial. En este último día ya quedan pocas palestras por tener. Muchísima gente de todo el mundo nos está escribiendo, está presente en todas las charlas que hemos tenido a lo largo de estas 4 jornadas.
Sí, efectivamente. Un gusto y un honor poder tener la visión del profesor, que es una visión distinta, complementaria a las que conocemos. Y esto creo que lo importante es que nos abre la cabeza, ¿no? ¿Qué te parece, Mika?
Sí, la verdad que sí, creo que es muy enriquecedor escucharlo y ahora tener una visión como un plus de lo que venimos escuchando y lo que era normal entender de las relaciones internacionales.
Así que, como fue una hora atrás, vamos a dar paso a un nuevo panel de estudiantes y graduados. Como siempre decimos, queremos ver los nuevos papers, queremos ver los nuevos investigadores, queremos escuchar qué es lo que piensan los jóvenes de América Latina y del mundo también sobre las relaciones internacionales, y aquí están presentes. Así que damos paso a este nuevo panel de estudiantes y graduados. Sin más, vamos a un pequeño break y seguimos con la próxima conferencia.